where you're dealing with the hospitals being able to hire lawyers who this is all they do, whereas families are really, hiring lawyers who have really very little experience in this area. So it's really a David and Goliath situation.
A British infant dies after being taken off life support against her parents' wishes. Why does a hospital trust decide the fate of a child? Bioethics and euthanasia experts weigh in. In a development that overshadowed the fall gathering of the U.S. Catholic bishops, Pope Francis removed a Texas bishop from his post. Bishop Joseph Strickland talks to EWTN News outside the bishops' meeting in Baltimore.
I think I can say safely that the situation is changing and has changed to a certain degree. So sensitivity has grown.
And an exclusive interview with one of the world's foremost experts on clergy sex abuse in the Catholic Church. Is the Church making progress?
For the Catholic Church in America, John Kennedy's election was a mixed blessing.
The world lost John F. Kennedy 60 years ago. His legacy as America's first Catholic president examined. EWTN News In Depth starts now. Angry and heartbroken. Those are the feelings of a couple in Britain after their terminally ill daughter was taken off life support against their wishes, in a move that some say violated their parental rights. Welcome to EWTN News In Depth. We begin today with a case that has made headlines around the world. 8-month-old Indi Gregory suffered from a rare metabolic disorder known as mitochondrial disease. Nicknamed their Mito Warrior, her parents fought to continue her treatment until earlier this week. Her doctor said her life support should be removed to allow her to die. Her parents, Dean and Claire, appealed this to the courts for a legal battle that included Italy's prime minister and the Vatican. Indi's parents pressed for the royal courts of justice to let them fly their daughter to Italy, where the Vatican's pediatric hospital, Bambino Gesù, offered to care for her. To do so, the Italian government even granted Indi citizenship. But the High Court sided with the hospital trust. A group supporting the family called Christian Concern says Indi Gregory died in the early hours of Monday, November 13th, after having her life support removed. Indi's father, Dean, released a statement writing, "Claire and I are angry, heartbroken, and ashamed. The NHS and the courts not only took away her chance to live a longer life, but they also took away Indi's dignity to pass away in the family home where she belonged." Indi Gregory's case is the latest in a series of cases in Britain in which doctors and parents have sparred over the treatment of terminally ill children. Alfie Evans in 2018 and Charlie Gard in 2017 were also ultimately denied the chance to travel to Italy by UK courts and died days after being removed from life support. Pope Francis has prayed for all of these cases. Following the death of Indi Gregory, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales released a statement expressing sadness and prayers for the family. The conference also called for greater weight for parental voices in such cases, with a plea to reintroduce an amendment to British health law known as Charlie's Law, named after Charlie Gard. The amendment aims to prevent disagreements between parents and doctors from reaching the courts. Movement in British Parliament to pass Charlie's Law is slow. To discuss this case, we're joined now by Professor David Jones, the director of the Anscombe Bioethics Center in England, and Alex Schottenberg, executive director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition in Ontario, Canada. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Professor, I'd like to start with you. I think it's really important to bring it home for us who don't really understand the UK system. What allows this trust to do what it does, and how does the trust work?
So people sometimes think that this is an argument between a doctor and a parent about the child, but the doctor is just part of a large hospital, and the hospital itself might be part of a larger sort of structure, a bit like you might think like an insurance company in the States. And so you have this very large organization, and it's that organization that's making the decisions. It's the trust manager that's making the decisions. And if it goes to court, really the trust holds all the cards. They have much better resources. They have full-time lawyers, and they control how much medical information the parents get. And unfortunately, that means there's almost an incentive for the trust, if there is a disagreement, to go to court, because the trust thinks that it's likely to win if it goes to court. Whereas if they have to argue it out with the parents, it might take longer, and they just want to have a quick decision.
And it seems that the trust acts as if these children had no parents at all. Alex, talk to us about the situation in Canada. Is this similar as well there, with the issue of parents not really having access to the care of their children or those decisions?
Well, there's some similarities in the fact that we have a universal healthcare system. So once again, you'd be dealing in a similar case with a hospital, which has massive resources. The other thing that makes it very interesting is these are rare type of court cases. So therefore, you're dealing with the hospitals being able to hire lawyers who this is all they do, whereas families are really, hiring lawyers who have really very little experience in this area. So it's really a David and Goliath situation every time. We have had some similar cases in Ontario, such as we had the Baby Joseph case a few years ago, which was very similar to these cases, and a little bit different, though, with the result. Nonetheless, this is a universal problem.
Absolutely. Now, Professor Jones, it seems we've had these cases over and over and over again. What do we need to learn from these tragedies?
Well, I think that in England the law needs to change, and there's a palliative care doctor who's also a member of the House of Lords, our upper chamber, and she introduced an amendment to the law, which I think would have been really helpful. And what it would have done is it would have just slowed the process down and required the trust to do various things before it went to court, including sharing information with the parents, including allowing other doctors to have information about about treatment, and the trust would have to show that there was actually harm involved if they went with what the parents wanted to do. So at the moment, it's simply, if there's a dispute, you can go to court, and as soon as you get to court, then the judge just makes an independent decision. So what we need to do in England, I think, is we need to look at the law.
Right, and that's the Charlie Gard law. Well, how then is this case, though, different? Was it different?
Depressingly, not very different. I mean, I think we haven't learned. I mean, we should have learned from Charlie Gard, and we should have learned from Alfie Evans and from Alta Fixler and from Pippa Knight. I mean, we've had these cases over and over. Sometimes, as with Charlie Gard, sometimes there's a novel therapy that you might want to try. Other times, it's not really about an alternative therapy. You just want to have more time and see how the child, whether she gets better, whether she gets worse, just to see how things would go naturally without thinking, well, let's withdraw treatment and then we know how things will go.
Right, for parents to really be able to have that in their hands. Alex, you've seen a troubling conflation of the issue of euthanasia with these cases, and I say troubling because it means that the public is missing something very important about the role of powerful governments or powerful institutions here. Clarify that for us, please.
Well, these cases are very upsetting and emotional, but they're not euthanasia when you actually withdraw treatment from someone and they die a natural death, because euthanasia is actually about doing an action to cause death or a specific omission, which would be like a basic care, such as dehydrating someone to death or something like that, which would be the intention to cause death. In this case, the child died a natural death, even though the circumstances, of course, are the issue at hand. And that there's a difference. There's a clear difference between killing and letting die. And this is where we see that clear difference in these cases. Not to say that what happened to the baby was, in my opinion, acceptable, but it's not euthanasia.
Right. It's the denial of life-saving treatment and the removal of life-sustaining care. Both very important
who makes
differences.
The decision? Because the judge has made the decision that the parents did not have the right to move the child to another hospital. In this case, of course, out of the country, it would have been in Rome. Nonetheless, it's usurping the right of the parents to try and make the best decision when they love their child. Like it's totally different than a case of abuse. This is parents who love their child who are trying to make the best decision for their child who's very sick.
Absolutely. Well, the idea of traveling, though, Professor Jones, is something that I'd love for you to kind of wrap up for us. You can travel anywhere you want to end your life. You can go have a customized experience in a pod, but you can't leave for life-saving treatment. Where is the logic in that?
So it's not about the fact that you can go to have assisted suicide in Switzerland, but you can't go for treatment somewhere. If you're an adult, you can. The problem is, if you have a child, it's like a custody battle. Except instead of between two of the parents, it's between the parents and the hospital, and the judge comes down in favour of the hospital. So the judge decides what the judge thinks is the best for the child, and then that's the decision. What it should be is, are the parents being reasonable? Are they harming the child? If they're not obviously harming the child, then it should remain in their hands, and that's not where we are with the law in England at the moment.
And it's a scary influence that it might have on the rest of the world. Last question for you, Alex, just to wrap up. In Canada, Quebec, that province is particularly notorious for the way that it uses and implements euthanasia, especially with the elderly. What are the points of pain that we should be watching around the world on this issue?
Well, in Canada, when we removed the terminal illness requirement, now, first of all, obviously, I'm opposed to killing people, so I'm opposed to all euthanasia. But when it went totally crazy is when we removed the terminal illness requirement. And now you have a situation of people who have disabilities. They qualify for euthanasia based on their disability, but they're asking for it based on poverty or homelessness or an inability to get medical treatment. And there's many other, social reasons why they're asking to die. So you see now that Quebec has become the highest euthanasia rate in the world, and it's gone really out of control. I'm very concerned because we're very early into this in Canada. It was only legalized in 2016. What I can say to the world is, don't legalize euthanasia. Don't ever do that. And the reason is that you can't really control it. And I'll give you one prime reason. All the restrictions they put into the original law, which I thought were just, ink on paper anyway. Nonetheless, all those restrictions have been torn down based on this concept of equality. You can't deny something to somebody else. That's why they got rid of the terminal illness requirement. They said it was unequal. When you deny this to someone who's not terminally ill, it was an unequal access to I would just say a legal situation. So and that's how the courts dealt with it, and that's how Canada's dealt with it. So equality ends up getting rid of your protections in law.
That's right, and it allows the government full control. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate your time on this. In other major news this week, the Israeli army is zeroing in on its main targets in Gaza City as the Israel-Hamas war continues to take more lives, including those of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Israeli defense forces are trying to root out Hamas terrorists from their command centers, believed to be concentrated in Gaza City, in a war sparked by the Hamas attack on Israeli citizens 6 weeks ago. The IDF says Hamas is using the large Al-Shifa hospital complex for military purposes, a claim denied by Hamas and medical officials. Targeting the area in and around the hospital for military operations has drawn international blowback and pressure on Israel. The United Nations is calling on Israel to grant a UN team access to Gaza so it can independently investigate the competing claims. Palestinians fleeing south walked among rubble and destroyed buildings as they tried to evacuate the hardest hit areas. More than 1.5 million people have been internally displaced in Gaza, where food, water, and electricity are increasingly scarce. In numbers from the Gaza Health Ministry, information controlled by Hamas, more than 11,000 civilians have been killed. Hamas claims 2/3 of the victims have been women and children. Thousands more are missing, mostly in heavily bombed northern Gaza.
If there is a hell on earth today, its name is northern Gaza. People who remain there, the corners of their existence is death, deprivation, despair, displacement, and literally darkness.
Even as some Palestinians evacuate to southern Gaza, there have now been warnings from the Israeli army to leave parts of those areas, as fighting is about to expand in the south as well. This leaves hundreds of thousands of people boxed in with no clear place of safety. Back in the U.S., in one of the largest pro-Israeli demonstrations yet, tens of thousands of people rallied in support of Israel on the Washington Mall on Tuesday. It comes as the war between Israel and Hamas enters its 6th week. Demonstrators at the rally called for a return of all hostages. They also said Israel has a right to exist and Jewish people have a right to freedom and safety. There's much more ahead on EWTN News In Depth, including insights from an important annual meeting of America's Catholic bishops.
I'm Catherine Hadro in Baltimore, where the U.S. bishops met this week to elect 6 new chairmen and tackle tough topics ranging from voting as a Catholic to caring for mental health. That's coming up.
People were still afraid of Catholicism and a Catholic president, and Protestant ministers were preaching against Kennedy and telling their congregants, do not vote for this man.
And later, it's the 60th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, how his Catholicism did and did not define his presidency. EWTN News In Depth is coming right back. In a move expected by some, the Vatican announced the removal of a popular and controversial bishop from his diocese. Pope Francis relieved Bishop Joseph Strickland of the Diocese of Tyler, Texas, last Saturday, just days after he refused to resign. The Vatican Dicastery for Bishops completed a formal investigation called an apostolic visitation earlier this year, with reports stating they were looking into the bishop's social media use and diocesan management. 65-year-old Strickland has faced criticism for his firebrand social media posts, including a tweet suggesting the Holy Father was undermining the deposit of the faith. The Diocese of Tyler, under Strickland's 10-year leadership, saw the resignation of 3 diocesan officials. But there were also positive signs of spiritual and administrative health, with 21 men in priestly formation and good finances. The Vatican gave no public reason for Strickland's removal. While technically allowed to attend the proceedings alongside other emeritus bishops, he was not in the meetings. Instead, Bishop Strickland was seen this week outside the building in Baltimore, Maryland, where the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops had its annual fall meeting. The Catholic leadership had a lot of important issues on their agenda. EWTN News contributor Catherine Hadro has our report.
My brother bishops, welcome to the public session of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Plenary Assembly.
From Rome to home, the U.S. bishops met in Baltimore for their annual fall meeting 2 weeks after the Synod on Synodality's first session wrapped up at the Vatican. The Pope's U.S. representative evoking the Synod early on in his welcome address.
The Eucharist is encounter. It is movement. Eucharistic revival and synodality go together.
The synodality and Eucharistic revival connection was reiterated by conference president Archbishop Timothy Broglio.
If you had to distill that down, what is it you believe the Holy Spirit is saying to the churches right now?
Well, I think actually the nuncio gave me a good entree into that, because he combined the two, I think, at least for the Church in the United States, the two major concerns right now, which is the Eucharistic revival and the whole process on synodality.
While the Synod and the Eucharist were themes threaded throughout the bishops' meeting, the church leaders also got to work on important action items this week. They voted to re-elect Oklahoma City Archbishop Paul Coakley as conference secretary and elected 6 new committee chairmen, including Bishop Daniel Thomas of Toledo as the next pro-life chair, beating out San Francisco Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone with nearly double the votes.
There are more than 200 U.S. bishops gathered here in Baltimore. I've heard from the bishops that this time is so important because they're often isolated and removed by distance, but here they can have that face-to-face time, which is essential in having what can be sensitive conversations.
Outside the meeting hall,
Son and of the Holy Spirit, amen.
Bishop Joseph Strickland led a midday rosary, just days after Pope Francis removed him as head of the Tyler, Texas diocese. He claims he was disinvited to this year's assembly. Effectively a retired bishop now, Strickland will be able to join future Baltimore meetings. In response to claims of mismanagement and poor governance in Tyler, Strickland says he has nothing to hide.
Look at the diocese. You can go on the Bishop's Appeal, which is our annual fundraiser, reached the record highs this past year. Just as all that investigation was happening, we got the news, the Bishop's Appeal at least pledges of $3.1 million, larger than ever in the history of the diocese. I mean, yes, there have been issues. About 5 years ago, there were significant personnel changes, but really since then, it's been pretty quiet.
Meanwhile, inside, the most anticipated vote centered around a voting guide introduction the bishops will circulate to U.S. Catholics ahead of the 2024 election. The bishops voted overwhelmingly with no floor debate to pass the Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship introduction letter, which names abortion as, quote, our preeminent priority. While that specific language has been a contentious issue for the bishops in the past, USCCB Vice President Archbishop William Lori explains why the unborn are of utmost importance.
I think what makes abortion so important for us is the utter vulnerability of the child in the womb.
The current pro-life chair, Bishop Michael Burbidge, says protecting the unborn is preeminent because it's foundational, and the bishops hope to better educate voters on that moving forward, given the post-Dobbs landscape and series of pro-life losses at the state level.
We have the truth. We have the truth, and we know that the truth will prove victorious. But we have to also be practical. What are the strategies? What is the messaging?
Reporting from Baltimore, Catherine Hadro, EWTN News In Depth.
Catherine joins us now in our D.C. studios with more insights on this fall's bishops' meeting. Catherine, it's great to have you here. Thank you for your report. The Synod on Synodality was a topic much discussed at the top of the proceedings, as you reported, with comments from top U.S. leaders. How were the effects of this global gathering seen at the meeting, especially knowing that while in Rome, you were there too, Archbishop Bergoglio mentioned that only a small number of U.S. Catholics participated or were aware of the Synod?
Yes, well, it was definitely a theme, but it was also an agenda item. We heard from Bishop Rhodes and Bishop Flores about their experience at the Synod in Rome. And to your point, Montse, about gathering more participation, they said, Bishop Rhodes and Bishop Flores, that they plan to do an executive summary of the synthesis document that came out of the Synod last month in October, because it's 41 pages. And realistically, the average Catholic is not going to sift through all of that. So the bishops plan to put together an executive summary and disseminate that out. Hopefully that'll cultivate more awareness. But when asked by EWTN News, what are the next steps for the Synod here in the U.S.? What's that schedule look like? The bishops did say that that's too early to say.
Wow, okay. Well, you noted that the much-awaited annual voter guide with the upcoming 2024 election was also discussed and voted on. Was there anything notable in that discussion?
I think what was the most notable was that there was no discussion. There was no floor debate on this document. And typically, when the bishops are discussing voting and how Catholic voters need to weigh the topic of abortion, along with other important issues, it can get, pretty tense in there. However, those conversations must have been happening behind closed doors and executive sessions, because the bishops voted overwhelmingly with no debate to include that language of our preeminent priority when it comes to abortion. Now, next fall at the meeting, the bishops will totally redraft that voting guide, that faithful citizenship document. It will come right after the 2024 presidential election, and it is largely expected to be more contentious next year.
Something to watch for sure. Well, texting in church and mental health awareness were also mentioned. Can we expect anything to come from those agenda items?
I will say Bishop Barron gave the update on the bishop's mental health campaign, and that led to very lengthy floor discussion. We heard from many bishops who voiced the need to inform and shape more psychiatrists who are knowledgeable about the Catholic faith and understand Catholic anthropology and understanding of the human person. We heard very movingly from Bishop Dolan over in Phoenix, who's lost 3 siblings to suicide as recently as last year. So it's something they're very aware of. When it came to the discussion about technology and divine worship, very interesting. The bishops spoke at their round tables, very synodal there, spoke at their round tables for 20 minutes in private conversation that, we could couldn't hear. It wasn't open to the floor discussion. So interested to hear how the bishops are weighing how technology should be implemented in the Mass, if at all.
Absolutely, especially post-COVID. Thank you so much, Catherine.
Thank you, Montse.
When we come back, an exclusive interview with Father Hans Zollner, the world-renowned expert in preventing church sex abuse, his current work, and why he abruptly left his Vatican position protecting minors.
More boys are abused than girls, which is contrary to all international statistics that we have.
Jesuit Father Hans Zollner discusses abuse in India after his recent trip there and addresses why he resigned from the Vatican's most important office battling sex abuse. Our exclusive on-the-record interview next.
Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. Last year, we brought you an important interview with Father Hans Zollner. He is regarded as one of the world's leading experts in the field of safeguarding and prevention of sexual abuse, particularly within the Catholic Church. At the time of the interview in September 2022, Father Zollner was a leading voice at the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. Correspondent Colin Flynn spoke to him about the psychology of sex abuse, the reasons why some priests abuse, and the plight of the victims. Just 6 months later came surprise and shock when Zollner abruptly resigned from the commission, citing concerns about transparency and accountability. Now, just over a year after that conversation, Father Zollner sat down again with Colin for his first television interview since his surprise resignation. He spoke about his current work and new revelations he's discovered about the devastation of child abuse in India. Here's Father Hans Zollner on the record.
Father Hans Zollner, good to see you again. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And how about you?
Doing very good. It's been around a year, I think, since we last spoke. And you've been a very busy man since then. We've a lot to get through, but we'll start with one of your recent trips to India. You went across different parts of India. What was the purpose of the trip?
The main purpose was, as always, giving conferences, workshops with church personnel and others in the area of safeguarding. And I mean, a byproduct of all this is getting to know what abuse is all about and what we can do as a church and a society to keep people safe.
Is it a taboo subject in India, or is it something that can be spoken about openly?
Now, sexuality as such is a huge taboo. As I learned this time, there is no place for young people where they learn about sexuality. There is no sexual education at school. Abuse is a taboo. It is not spoken about, but it is happening. And as I have seen now in the last 10 days or so, it is coming up in different quarters of society and in different sectors of church life.
And when we last met, you made the point that, of course, we've heard so much about abuse cases coming out in the West and in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere, but the stories are slow to come out from across Asia, across Africa, and you made the point that, make no mistake about it, it's happening there. The stories just haven't broke yet, the scandals. Is there a sense of that in India, that we haven't heard the stories from there yet, or they haven't broke?
Now, the thing is exactly what you say, they have not come out.
Still.
And we don't talk about the church alone. There are statistics from the Indian government from some years back that says, quote, half of the whole youth population in India is sexually abused. If you count in the 1.4 billion Indians that exist and take half of the youth population, which is huge, you come to the figure of about 200 million youth that the Indian government says has been sexually abused up to the age of 18. So when it comes to the society in India, in all probability, it is much more pervasive in families, in the villages out there in the outback of the Indian huge continent that you have. And the question is, where does it happen and how people are encouraged to talk about it, especially if it happens and when it happens in the family context or in areas and sectors of society that are considered to be most respected. For example, all religions.
so many people were happy with the progress that the Catholic Church was making, particularly here at the Vatican, and then the recent case of Father Rupnik and how that has been handled by the Church and the stories that have come out about the alleged abuse that he has perpetrated. Such a famous Jesuit, such a renowned artist within the Catholic Church whose work is all over the globe, a friend of Pope Francis. How do you think the Church has been handling his case?
There have been many big question marks about the handling of the case. So how did it start? How was the allegation brought forward? Who was responsible for the lifting of the excommunication, and what were the reasons for that? We don't know. I mean, at least I don't know, and the public, I think, doesn't know about who was finally responsible for all this.
But isn't that what people were hoping was a thing of the past? That we would be having an interview like this saying, well, we're happy that finally they're looking into it, or because the pressure has been put on Pope Francis a bit that he's reopening the case. It's that who's responsible, who's looking into it, and then eventually maybe people get off with things or they just kind of fade into the distance.
Yeah, first, the Church doesn't change as a whole in 1 year, in 10 years. We are talking about a change of mentality, and the change that will certainly need a generation. This is what I started to say 10 years back or even longer. So we are in the middle of this change process. And it is, as we see, it is not easy, and there are steps backwards, and there is not a real consistency in this. Yeah? And this makes it very difficult to get to the point where one takes also the personal responsibility for wrongdoings.
Sticking with accountability for a moment, because since you and I last spoke, you had been working at the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors for almost 10 years, almost a decade.
9 years, yeah.
9 years. The most important department in the Vatican for safeguarding children and implementing measures for protecting vulnerable people. You were central to this. It was established by Pope Francis in 2014. And then you surprised so many people earlier this year when all of a sudden you announced you were resigning, you were leaving. What happened?
I had tried from about May 2022 to November the same year to reach out to the president of the commission. I had sent a number of emails and I didn't get even an acknowledgement of receipt of those emails. We met in person and there was no sense of, any type of getting back to me on some points that I was concerned about. Keeping compliance rules, accountability issues and transparency are followed through also within the Commission. I tried to raise my concerns and to make them known, but there was no reply. And then, I came to the point where I couldn't be within the Commission and stand for it if those principles, from my point of view, were not applied.
But because of your expertise, and you were held in such high regard when it comes to this issue, so there's so much weight behind your opinion and what you think or what you say about something. So when you had said things like lack of accountability, financial transparency, clarity on issues, it sounded like there were serious things wrong within the Commission.
Yeah, otherwise I wouldn't have brought them up with the Commission itself, and I wouldn't have taken that step to ask the Holy Father to let me go. And he, agreed to that. On the other hand, he appointed me to the Diocese of Rome's Safeguarding Commission.
Was he surprised, Pope Francis, when you came to him and said you were leaving the commission?
Yes, he was surprised, yeah. But he listened to my points, and in the end he decided that he would agree to me for my leaving the commission.
Father Hans Zollner, thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin.
Column has more from this interview with Father Zollner on the EWTN YouTube page, including additional details about his work at the Gregorian University, where he's director of its Institute of Anthropology, concentrating on human dignity and care. The leaders of the U.S. and China meet face-to-face. A code of conduct at the Supreme Court gets mixed reviews, and the Vatican's trial of the century is almost over. The Week in Review is next. The two most powerful politicians in the world met this week in California. That story tops the Week in Review. U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping had 4 hours of meetings near San Francisco before the start of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Gathering. Relations between the U.S. and China have been tense, and foreign policy observers say the very fact that the talks occurred at all is a good sign. Despite economic, political, and military competition, President Xi told President Biden the Earth is big enough for both the U.S. and China to succeed. During their talks, the two leaders discussed the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits and the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. They agreed to resume high-level military-to-military contact to avoid accidents and misunderstandings. And they also agreed to open up a direct phone line between the two presidents to talk directly in case of a crisis. There was also an announcement that China would curb fentanyl production.
More people in the United States between the ages of 18 and 49 die from fentanyl than from guns, car accidents, or any other cause, period. So today, with this new understanding, we're taking action to significantly reduce the flow of precursor chemicals and pill presses from China to the Western Hemisphere. It's going to save lives, and I appreciate President Xi's commitment on this issue.
Of much lesser importance, of course, but clearly a sign of goodwill, President Xi also announced China would again send the U.S. new pandas, likely this time to the San Diego Zoo. China has slowly been reclaiming its pandas, and just last week, 3 from the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. were returned, much to the dismay of thousands of American panda fans. Government shutdown averted, at least until after the holidays. President Biden signed a stopgap bill on Thursday after the Senate and House passed the temporary government funding package earlier in the week. Funding would have expired on Friday. Newly elected House Speaker Mike Johnson is supporting a 2-step plan that sets up one deadline in January and another in February. Funding for military construction, transportation, veterans affairs, housing, and energy is extended to mid-January. Anything not covered by the first step would be funded until February 2nd. The proposal does not include additional aid for Israel or Ukraine. In a historic move, the U.S. Supreme Court announced this week it has agreed to a code of conduct. The court had faced a steady stream of criticism in recent months over undisclosed lavish trips and gifts to some justices. The justices say the code largely represents a codification of principles they've long regarded as governing their conduct, and indicated any problems are primarily the misunderstanding by the public of the justices' ethical standards. Experts in legal ethics acknowledge the code was a step in the right direction in response to public concern. However, it was also criticized for failing to explain how the code would work or who would enforce the rules, particularly over financial reporting requirements. Critics say it leaves too many decisions up to the discretion of individual justices.
I regard the Supreme Court's decision to create a code for itself as really good news. I think it's been a long time in coming. They've had a lot of trouble in recent years, and promulgating a code is a good way to address those problems. The concern I've got is that it's not enough for the court to write these things down on a piece of paper. They need to embrace that code. They need to act upon it. They need to, to avoid the problems that they've had in the past. And it's unclear whether they are committed enough to their new code to do that.
Debate over whether the High Court should be bound by an ethics code has persisted for years. Although an ethics code does bind judges in the lower federal courts, those rules have never governed the Supreme Court. A high-profile court case is winding towards a close at the Vatican. Cardinal Angelo Becciu was one of the most powerful men in the Vatican until he was linked to a corruption scandal involving a botched London real estate deal. He's the highest-ranking Vatican official to ever face trial. With recent developments in the court case, here's Benjamin Crockett from the EWTN Vatican Bureau.
The Vatican's so-called trial of the century is finally nearing an end. 10 defendants are on trial, charged with several crimes, including embezzling Vatican funds and money laundering in the purchase of an expensive investment property in London between 2014 and 2018. The most high profile is Cardinal Angelo Becciu, the Vatican's former Deputy Secretary of State. The trial marks the first time in history a cardinal has been tried by lay judges in the Vatican's court. The financial scandal has been in the headlines for years. After a 2-year Vatican investigation of alleged financial malfeasance, court proceedings have stretched more than 2 years. The Vatican maintains that the €350 million investment deal was designed to defraud the Secretariat of State of millions of euros. The defendants have been adamant their actions were above board and that Vatican authorities were in the know. In hearings last week, defense attorneys attacked the prosecution on largely procedural grounds, calling for a mistrial. They said the investigation was biased, chaotic, and had ulterior interests designed to protect higher-level Vatican officials. EWTN News Vatican analyst Andrea Gargladucci has been following the recent developments in the trial and says key defense arguments will be made next week for Becciu, following last week's defense for the Vatican's Financial Intelligence Authority.
The next important hearing will be November 22nd, when the lawyers of Cardinal Becciu will speak. And so these are the two keys, in my view, Financial Intelligence Authority and Cardinal Becciu, for two main reasons. Because the Financial Intelligence Authority worked along the Secretariat of State in order also to fix the investments and to help the Holy See to recover money, or to recover an investment that was a good investment, in my view, but was poorly managed.
Becciu has always denied all wrongdoing, claiming the investment, which eventually lost €100 million for the Vatican, was managed by his successor, Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra. But prosecutors say Becciu is liable because he approved the initial investment, its financing, and used unconventional accounting procedure to conceal the multi-million-euro real estate deal. The Vatican court president said the last week of hearings will be held in mid-December and a verdict will be reached by Christmas. Benjamin Crockett, EWTN News in Depth.
To discuss the latest on the Becciu trial, we're joined by Hannah Brockhouse. She's the senior Rome correspondent for the Catholic News Agency. Hannah, it's so great to have you back. There's been a recent flurry of activity and hearings in this case. The defense seems to be fighting back on procedural grounds. What can you tell us about that and if they're actually getting into the merits of this case?
Yeah, that's right, Montse. So after a brief summer break, they've gotten back into hearings, and it seems an earlier promise to have a conclusion to this case by the end of the year has really pushed them to really consolidate a little bit and encourage the defense attorneys that are kind of having their moment to defend their clients to really address the issues quickly and on a tight timeline so that we can have a result, a verdict before Christmas. So what we're hearing a lot from defense lawyers is a lot of objections, like you said, on procedural grounds. They are entering a little bit into the merits of the case and trying to show how their clients were acting completely, of course, above board, that their actions were all perfectly legal and done with the agreement of people inside the Vatican. But also a lot of time has been spent on exactly criticizing the way the investigation has taken place, the way the case now in court has been laid out, and even as much as the ways that Pope Francis himself has stepped in have come under criticism. Some of the changes to the way the court proceeds has been criticized as well.
Well, that's significant when we look back, but Cardinal Becciu's defense attorneys are front and center next week. What do you expect to happen?
Well, so next week is when exactly Becciu's lawyer will have his chance in court to defend the cardinal. So we're waiting to hear what he'll have to say. Obviously, the cardinal earlier in the trial himself stood and gave some speeches before the court where he defended himself, but he didn't always enter into all of the merits of the case. No, he didn't enter into all the details. And so we're obviously looking for a strong defense from Becciu's lawyers to show that he isn't guilty of the crimes that he's been accused of.
Now, Hannah, the church around the world has been watching this carefully. We're all looking for that transparency that Pope Francis has promised on the financials in the church, in the Vatican. Do you think that all of the attention on alleged financial malfeasance in this case has made a difference in the way various Vatican offices conduct their businesses? Do your sources and your reporting tell you anything new?
Well, I think it will be interesting to see exactly what happens following this trial, because obviously what happens with the verdict, whether Becciu is found guilty or not of any of the many charges against him, I think that could then have a ripple effect. But honestly, during this trial, which has been obviously, years long now, I wouldn't say we've seen as many changes. There were some changes in the Vatican before that, during the investigation and when all of that scandal and financial scandal was coming out. In the interim, I think things have been a little bit on hold. So I'm waiting to see what that verdict does, if that spurs more changes or if we're a little bit at a standstill at this point.
Well, we'll be watching next week very carefully and looking forward to a decision over Christmas. Thank you so much, Hannah.
You're welcome.
And some good news in the healthcare field in the United States, with doctors upholding their Hippocratic oath to do no harm. This week, the American Medical Association's House of Delegates voted to stand firm on its opposition to assisted suicide. They voted down several resolutions, including a rejection to change their position from opposition to neutral on physician-assisted suicide. The committee also kept the AMA's policy that physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally inconsistent with the physician's professional role.
It's a good indication that physician-assisted suicide is not popular in the medical profession, and that the ethics of that is being maintained, even though there is a lobby that is trying to push very hard for this, and certain physicians and certain organizations are doing that. But the AMA, thanks be to God, is maintaining a strong position, saying this is not in our medical tradition, and we don't want to start.
Assisted suicide is legal in several U.S. states, including California, Oregon, New Jersey, and Maine. Leaders with the March for Life have announced the theme for the 2024 March in January. It is "With Every Woman, for Every Child." The march in Washington, D.C. is the largest pro-life gathering in the nation and was created to protest Roe v. Wade. It has continued despite the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe in 2022 with a slightly altered route. It originally ended at the Supreme Court. It now finishes between the court and the Capitol building to focus on the need for legislative changes. The 2024 march is scheduled for January 18th. EWTN will be broadcasting the march live and will include pro-life stories from all angles. Next, remembering John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Kennedy lived here in Georgetown before becoming president. During that time and after his election, he could be found here going to Mass at the neighborhood Catholic Church.
Reporter Mark Irons takes us through the life and times of our nation's first Catholic president. We'll be right back.
"60 years ago this month, the world was stunned when President John F. Kennedy was killed, his life cut short by an assassin's bullet in Dallas, Texas. Decades later, the shock of Kennedy's murder still reverberates as we imagine the life that could have been had he not been taken from us in the prime of life. JFK was America's first Catholic president. And from that perspective, reporter Mark Irons looks at the Kennedy legacy.
A moment seared into memory.
We can't see who has been hit, if anybody's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong.
I am in my second grade class at St. Albert the Great Catholic School in Louisville, Kentucky.
Barbara Perry recalls that Friday in late November 1963, her class was working on an art project in preparation for Thanksgiving the following week.
The project was coloring pictures of pilgrims. And all of a sudden, I looked up, the teacher turned towards us and said, "The president's been shot. Please line up, we're going to church to pray for him."
It's official now, the president is dead.
The news hit home, especially for many Catholics like Perry's parents and grandparents.
That week, then, as we got together for Thanksgiving, they were speaking about President Kennedy as if he were a family member.
Early childhood memories of JFK paved the way for a career. A professor of presidential studies at the University of Virginia, Barbara Perry has written numerous books on past presidents, but her favorite is Kennedy, and she's not alone.
Even 60 years later, if you look at polls, Kennedy will often be at or near the top.
Starting in the late 1940s, Kennedy took major political aspirations to Washington. He would serve as a U.S. congressman, then senator. During his time as a lawmaker, he lived a few miles from the Capitol building in the Georgetown neighborhood, first moving into this apartment where he could walk to Mass at Holy Trinity Catholic Church. But his hope for the White House was complicated by his faith. Anti-Catholic prejudice was alive in America. When Kennedy was just a boy in 1928, politician Al Smith, a Catholic, had run for president.
And he was vanquished in a landslide by Herbert Hoover because he was Catholic.
People were afraid of having a Catholic president?
They were afraid of having a Catholic president because they said the Pope would run the country.
Those fears continued up to the 1960 presidential election.
Because I am a Catholic.
So 2 months before Americans would vote, during a pivotal speech in front of Protestant pastors in Houston, Kennedy said he believed in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, and he clarified his Catholic faith would not influence his presidency.
I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me.
The speech paid off. On the morning of January 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy started his day with Mass at Holy Trinity Church and later gave his inaugural presidential address to the nation.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
For the first time, a Catholic moved into the White House.
It certified that a Catholic could be accepted in the highest office in the land, and that was a really important barrier to break.
But at the same time, political science professor Matthew Wilson, a Catholic himself and director of the Center for Faith and Learning at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, calls the JFK presidency a mixed blessing for the Catholic Church in America.
It came with a price because it showed that a Catholic could only be accepted if he was willing to leave a significant part of his faith at the door. Separation of church and state does not mean the marginalization or the sidelining of our deepest values that are derived from our religious faith.
The values JFK derived from his faith may have ultimately shown up in some of his policy, from his support of civil rights, social justice, and potentially avoiding a nuclear war by seeking a peaceful end to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he was explicit about this.
I believe in a president whose views on religion are his own private affair.
He was president before things like abortion and same-sex unions, both contrary to Catholic faith, would be widely debated in political forums. It's unclear how his views about those issues may have impacted his political decisions. But since Kennedy, Wilson believes a pattern has emerged. People of faith elected to public office, both Democrats and Republicans, often sacrifice or misuse faith convictions for political purposes.
Time and time again, they choose party over church. They choose party values over religious values.
For Kennedy, the separation of his personal and public life may have gone deeper than just politics. In the limelight, the many photos show off a charismatic family man. But there was another side hidden in shadows at the time.
So we've seen the pictures of him with his wife and his children. So was he living a double life?
Yes. He was an incorrigible womanizer and cheated many times on his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. So yes, he led a promiscuous life in his personal life.
That could lead to more questions about how deep his faith convictions really were to begin with. Even so, Perry says Kennedy continued to keep a spiritual routine.
President Kennedy, throughout his presidency and throughout his life, went to Mass religiously every Sunday.
According to the First Lady, her husband also went to confession sometimes, and though he may have had his own doubts about faith, he prayed.
Yes, he probably had some questions about his faith, but she said every night he was down on his knees saying his prayers.
For weekend getaways, John and Jacqueline Kennedy, along with their two children, Caroline and John Jr., would spend time outside of Washington in the countryside near Middleburg, Virginia. So in the early 1960s, St. Stephen Martyr Catholic Church was completed with the president in mind. A storage closet by the entrance was once a safe room built by the Secret Service in case of emergencies. Inside the sanctuary, a plaque now marks the president's pew. A number of photos show the Kennedys walking to and from Mass, but those Sundays wouldn't last long.
In the spring of 1963, this church was dedicated, but that fall, tragedy would strike. On November 10th, John F. Kennedy attended Mass here for the last time.
The family was all together. A picture captures the moment as the Kennedys walked into church. The following Sunday, on November 17th, a quick trip to West Palm Beach, Florida. There, inside St. Anne Church, a newspaper photo still hangs, showing a smiling president as he was leaving Mass. Just 5 days later, he was in Dallas, riding along in the fateful motorcade.
President Kennedy has been assassinated.
The nation mourned as the president's funeral mass was held at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington. His young son stood outside the church, giving his father a final salute. Today, the floor is marked where the casket lay before President Kennedy was buried in Arlington Cemetery, as the marker reads, where his remains lie in expectation of a heavenly resurrection.
People were praying for him, for our country.
Monsignor John Ensler, a Catholic priest in Washington, was a high schooler in '63. Reflecting on the life of Kennedy now, Ensler sees it as something of a cautionary tale for all modern politicians on both sides of the aisle who proclaim the Christian faith yet reject it in aspects of their personal life or public policy making.
Sin is like a cancer. When you fall into a sin, it begins to eat away at your very being.
And that's a warning for everyone, but the mercy of God extends to all. Monsignor says to not accept forgiveness and reform our lives would be the real tragedy. For as much as death brings mourning, it would be much worse to make choices that reject eternal life.
The tragedy would be to lose your soul. To say, I'm not being able to enter God's kingdom because of my actions, because of my decisions, because of my rejection of what in conscience I know is right.
Mark Irons, EWTN News In Depth.
This is not all of our reporting on the John F. Kennedy legacy. Mark has an extended version of this report, which will be released on the November 22nd anniversary of the assassination. It has additional content and context and can be seen on the EWTN YouTube page. And that does it for this edition of EWTN News In Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. Next week at this time over the Thanksgiving weekend, there will be a special showing of a new EWTN docudrama on the Spanish Inquisition. Our program will be back 2 weeks from now, and we hope to see you then.